reasonable grounds to conclude that an array of war crimes and violations of human rights and international humanitarian law have been committed in Ukraine. The experts of the OSCE Moscow mechanism concluded that international humanitarian law and international human rights law has been extensively violated in the conflict in Ukraine. The mission also concluded that some of these violations were likely to amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The OHCHR monitoring mission has documented violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, such as unlawful killings, including summary executions of civilians in more than 30 settlements in Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy region. The numbers from the latest report published yesterday are devastating, highlighting that the human cost of the war in Ukraine has left at least 8,000 civilians dead and more than 13,000 injured over the past 12 months. Today we will hear first-hand testimonies that the international community can't ignore. We need to continue to call out violations and condemn what is taking place. We recall the order on provisional measures by the International Court of Justice of 16th March last year that Russia shall immediately suspend the military operations that it commenced on 24 February last year in the territory of Ukraine. The principal judicial organ of the United Nations has stated it clearly. We call on Russia to comply, to stop the war. We, as the international community, must show that we will not tolerate any country trampling on the UN Charter. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now we will give the floor to Foreign Minister Flores of Guatemala. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Harper, for giving me the floor. Victory for human rights, justice for Ukraine, and accountability. That is the reason that we are here, dear friends and excellencies. This is the moment that we need to strongly condemn the unjustified and unprovoked aggression by the Russian Federation against the territorial integrity and the population of Ukraine. These actions constitute a flagrant violation of the United States Nations Charter. We are extremely concerned what is happening today, but we represent the voice of the ones that doesn't have a voice today. The numbers that we're going to hear today can be not tolerated. It is admissible and we should reprehend it. For the reason that we are here together to prevail on peace, the UN General Assembly has recognized that Russia must be held accountable for the violations of the international law, international humanitarian law, and human rights. We are going to appeal today to all of you that we can come together with conclusions that can be able to allow us to bring Russia accountable for what is happening. We are very concerned about the increase of the numbers that we have of people that need human aid and rights that we need to be able to provide. Throughout this year, the intensive hostilities by Russia has caused destruction, deaths, and grievances to the civilians, and including women and children, forced to evacuate their homes. As a result, Ukrainians are without access to food, drinking water, medical assistance, and basic services. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is extremely alarming that Russian military operations has not ceased, including the increase of launchings of different types of missiles against civilian population, flagrantly violating the international law, international humanitarian law, including threats of a possible use of nuclear weapons. The President of the Republic of Guatemala, Dr. Alejandro Yamatei Fay, and myself witnessed firsthand the atrocities caused by this aggression. During our visit to Ukraine last year, the scene was devastating. That is why today I call to the international community that we need to be able to work together to achieve peace and make the necessary commitments to prevent the armed clashes between the nations, through dialogue, negotiation, and peace means provided by the international law. As a result, my country, Guatemala, co-facilitated the resolution adopted last 14th of November that requested the creation of an international register of damages against Ukraine. Guatemala also co-sponsored the resolution 49-1 of the Human Rights Council, which established the International Independent Commission of Inquiry to investigate the violation stemming from the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We have also supported all initiatives to seek the creation of a special tribunal for the crimes committed of this aggression. At this time, we need to raise the voice to end this conflict. Guatemala joins the call for a ceasefire to the end hostilities against civilians in Ukraine. Guatemala, as a state that respectfully continue to respect international law and is very proud of the peace vocation that we have, calls for diplomacy to be able to be prevented and integrated. Today, raise the voice for the ones that are needed. And the voices is theirs. No more life needs to be lost. No more civilians needs to be wounded. No more mothers needs to be able to suffer for the loss of their children. Accountability, victory for human rights is needed. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now we will turn the floor over to the Minister Jolly of Canada, Foreign Minister of Canada. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Harper. Thank you for this opportunity to join all of you and my friend, Mitro, Minister Kuleba, and other ministers at this essential event to hear firsthand accounts of some of the consequences of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Il y a un an, une invasion à grande échelle d'un voisin souverain semblait inimaginable, mais pour les Ukrainiens, c'est devenu leur réalité. Today, Ukrainians are not only defending their country from the evil of Putin and his enablers, they are defending their rights, the principles of the UN Charter, and the values of freedom and democracy that so many of us hold dear. There's no option but victory for Ukraine. Canada will be there to support Ukraine's fight for freedom for as long as it takes. And once they win, we will help them to recover. Last week, I was in Ukraine to reaffirm just that. I met with courageous and resilient Ukrainians from all walks of life who are passionate about rebuilding Ukraine once they are victorious. In our conversation, it was clear, for reconstruction to be inclusive and enduring, it must address both the physical and invisible impacts of Putin's war on men, women, and children, victims of the war. And so we must tackle the psychological marks of the war with the same seriousness and urgency as the physical scars. To heal the trauma that has been inflicted on the population, we must support survivors in seeking justice. This pursuit of accountability will be essential to achieving lasting peace in Ukraine. The efforts Ukrainians are making to provide relief to their fellow citizens, even as the war rages, is inspiring in a world awash in too much suffering. It drove home for me the need for the international community, of all of us, to continue helping Ukraine. Let me be clear. Russia's war on Ukraine is unjustifiable. It is illegal. Russian forces have committed and continue to commit indiscriminate and appalling acts across Ukraine. They have destroyed entire cities, targeted hospitals and playgrounds. In an act of incredible horror, they have ripped children away from their homes. They have taken the lives of too many families. In Ukraine, I met with the Prosecutor General to discuss his work to gather evidence and prosecute those responsible for crimes linked to the war, including conflict-related sexual violence. He is dealing, as we speak, with some 60,000 cases, and this number climbs with each passing day. The details included in each are horrific, yet those figures do not provide a full picture of the widespread human suffering occurring each of the 363 days of Putin's war. For every individual who is willing to tell their story, many others go unreported due to the stigma and feelings of shame, as mentioned by First Lady Zelenska a bit earlier. And I also met with Ukrainian police officers, psychologists, prosecutors, and investigators who are working to investigate and prosecute these crimes while supporting survivors of this violence. And Canada will continue to support them. Those responsible for this suffering will answer for their crimes. They will be met with the full force of the law. Canada welcomes Ukraine's case against Russia at the International Court of Justice, and we continue to support the International Criminal Court's efforts in Ukraine. We have also joined the core group launched by Ukraine, my friend Dmytro, in examining the proposal to establish a special tribunal on the crime of aggression, a crime which may not fall within the scope of existing institutions. Together, we will leave no stone unturned as we identify the most effective ways to hold Russia accountable for its crime of aggression. This is also aimed at deterring others who are watching us, considering if they could ever challenge the rules. The emergency session of the General Assembly will meet today and vote tomorrow on a resolution on UN Charter principles underlying a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Je sais que les Ukrainiens comptent sur le soutien de la communauté internationale pour les aider à parvenir à la paix. And Canada calls on all member states to support the resolution and, through it, to continue supporting the principles of the UN Charter and the people of Ukraine. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Your Excellency. As each of our distinguished ministers have noted, what is essential is accountability. And so one piece of that accountability is the International Criminal Court, and we welcome online the Honorable Karim Khan, King's Counsel and prosecutor at the ICC.
Distinguished foreign ministers, ladies and gentlemen, it's really a somber moment, and it's an awful and unwanted necessity to be assembled together today. As has been said by the distinguished speakers already, as is known to the world that have seen the pictures, that have heard the voices, terrible trauma and suffering has been occasioned to Ukraine and her people over the last 1 year. In May of last year, I was in Bucha, outside St. Peter's Church, with the then Prosecutor General, with my team, and with the Ukrainian investigators that were working with courage to document the crimes that appeared to have been committed. I saw the body bags, and we heard the accounts. And in the subsequent months, the investigations conducted by my office have deepened. In Borodyanka, in Kharkiv, and when I left, I thought really about left behind because shells were falling. I left Kharkiv, my small team, and we went to Kyiv, but Ukrainian investigators and prosecutors remained in a city that was on the front line, and this is repeated across Ukraine. I said very clearly in Bucha that unfortunately and objectively, Ukraine was a crime scene. And the accounts that we have seen fortify the conclusion that manifestly, ever more vividly, we are certain that there are reasonable grounds to that Rome Statute crimes appear to have been committed in Ukraine. We've seen, and it's been mentioned by the First Lady of Ukraine and others, we've seen the pictures of the injured regarding the maternity ward in Mariupol or the theater. We've seen and heard accounts of the targeting of the grids. We've seen and heard allegations of prisoners of war that are recounting allegations of torture. We have heard and spoken to individuals who are complaining of sexual and gender-based violence. We have seen and heard the predicament of children who appear to have been taken across international borders. And our joint responsibility is to make sure the law is on the front lines. It is not an optional extra. It is not something that we come to with a degree of pedestrian approach. We need to act with dispatch while the bullets are being fired and as bombs are falling, because I have seen either on the border of Poland when grandmothers and women and children crossed the border early on at the end of February and beginning of March, that the law matters to individuals. Whilst many have lost their physical shelter, they are looking increasingly to the law to give them shelter now for what they've endured and to mitigate or ameliorate the worst types of excesses that far too often take place in conflict. And therefore, the seriousness of the situation from any perspective is well known to everybody. And yet in the despair of uncertainty, we have also seen numerous times courage, indefatigable energy, and determination to survive, to prosper, and to succeed. There is a saying, of course, that the darkest part of the night is just before the dawn. And God alone knows whether or not we have seen the worst, but we pray so. But in the midst of the disruption, the uncertainty, when the anchors of stability seem to have been uprooted in so many places around the world, we do see rays of hope. In an unprecedented move, within 48 hours of my invitation, 39 states spoke with one voice from all corners of the world that the situation in Ukraine should be referred to my office. We now have 43 states. We have seen new partnerships being built. The foreign minister of the Netherlands, Wopke Hoekstra, has to be applauded, as does the government of the Netherlands, in pioneering with my office a unique, novel, rotational model for forensic experts to go under the of the ICC to help document crime scenes, to collect evidence to the highest international standards, to help the Ukrainian national authorities, and also to provide evidence to my office in a way that will facilitate independent and impartial investigation. Since May of last year, we've had a continuous field presence in Ukraine. We've partnered also with, for the first time in the history of the office, with a joint investigative team, 7 states now under the auspices of Europe. And we've also tried to build new bridges, realizing that there's no space for disinterest. There's no space for spectators in this battle conscience of humanity, this imperative that the law is rendered effective in this critical moment of world affairs. It's something, for many reasons, has to transcend Ukraine and galvanize us all to do better when it comes to adherence of law. And so we've also partnered with the Genocide Network and also Eurojust to produce civil society lines to make sure that those brave and enthusiastic documenters can also be given some guidance, facilitate their work to document as first responders and also refer matters to the national prosecution agencies and the office. So in the darkness of the hour, we do have these rays of hope. And the lesson that does need to be understood by all of us as students, all of us with is that the law must be seen to be potent. So this moment is a moment of opportunity, but for us to deliver on that, I would also, with respect, echo wise words, if I may say so, of the First Lady of Ukraine. And she said a few minutes that human rights, like the air, have no border. It's really important. And the prosecutor of the ICC is not any state or any government, and is not against any state or any government. The prosecutor of the ICC must be to be a friend of humanity and a servant of justice. And the simple truth of the matter is, we need to use this moment also to make sure that the concerns that are here in various parts of the world, particularly the global south, are addressed, and we use this moment to give rise to any arguments of exceptionalism or of selectivity. And well before the situation in Ukraine really went over the tipping point in February the 24th of last year, that was the most recent, of course, aggression. I said on the 16th of June 2021, a year and a half ago, when I was sworn in, that I'm not in the export business. I'm not selling a product to states. That the Rome Statute that I've sworn to uphold and apply independently and impartially is not the law of Italy. The Geneva Conventions are not the law of Switzerland. And I said that for a reason. I continued that this law that we apply is not the property of the global north, any more so than it is of the global south. It unites people because it is the lost property of humanity. The Islamic world and the Christendom. You look at the Talmud, you look at the teachings of Confucius or Buddha, in all countries, in all cultures, in all nations, in all people, resonate or find voice in fundamental principles of humanity that bind us together. And I think this realization that who is a friend for justice and who is an enemy to those that would commit genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes anywhere in the world, provide this or constitute a singular moment for us to come together and do better across the world. We've tried to show that dynamism in a number of situations. In Libya last year, we applied for new warrants. We've tried to increase our field presence, not only in Kyiv, but in Cox's Bazar, or in Caracas and in other parts of the world. We're trying to move forward with confirmation hearings in Joseph Kony case, to move forward. And if we seize this moment of opportunity, if we realize with greater acuteness, the law is not something that can be taken and left. It's not part of an a la carte menu that we can choose what we want. This dark moment, this moment of uncertainty for Ukraine, can be a moment for us to together as humanity and show the victims, the survivors, the very courageous people that are going to speak in a moment, that from Kyiv to Cox's Bazar, from Kharkiv to Khartoum, international justice is on their side. And if we do that, perhaps we can move more positively in a better direction to make finally, once and for all, in the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we deliver on the promise of never again and the prayer of a world with more justice and less crime. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Khan, for those powerful remarks. I just want to close this session by thanking our distinguished ministers for their insightful, sobering, and important observations. Given the time, I'll just close by saying this. I want to recall what this building is all about.
Where is the Secretary General?
This building
Where is he?
is about,
The violation of the UN Charter.
this building is about the international rules-based order and upholding it. And Russia's aggression has been the most glaring vitiation of that of the UN Charter and of what this manifestation, this institutional manifestation is all about. And so, as every one of our distinguished ministers has observed, accountability is essential. Staying steadfast in our resolution to end this conflict and to bring accountability is our mission. So with that, I will close this panel. Thank you all for your remarks.
Your Excellencies, esteemed ambassadors, we are about to begin the first of two interesting panels. I welcome everybody to take a seat and thank you for your attention. Once again, Your Eminences, Your Excellencies, esteemed ambassadors, distinguished government officials, and our honored guests. This will be the first of two panel discussions with witnesses. This one is entitled The Violations of the Rights of Prisoners of War. There will be a Q&A session, time permitting, which is why I'm trying to get everybody to their seats. We encourage you to ask questions during this first and second panels when we have our honored guests with us to help us in our deliberations going further. My name is Andriy Dobryansky. I'll be the moderator for this panel. I am the chair of UN Affairs for the Ukrainian World Congress, which is the International Assembly of Ukrainian non-governmental organizations representing over 20 million people. I would also like to acknowledge that I am joined, as always in this chamber, by my good colleague, Dr. Marta Kebalo, Chair of the Commission for the United Nations for the World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations, also registered with ECOSOC along with the Ukrainian World Congress. To every extent that it is possible, the organized Ukrainian diaspora has been dedicating numerous services, focusing our attention on this war. However, this panel is related to crimes that are even beyond our comprehension. The willful killing, torture, or inhuman treatment, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health of the Ukrainian prisoners of war are all grave breaches of the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The emergence of information about these crimes, brutal war crimes committed by the occupying force against Ukrainian prisoners of war, has coincided at times with the revelation of crimes against detention facilities as well. As an international community, we have heard of the special UN rapporteur about crimes being committed against civilians, and today we hope to open up the dialogue a little bit more about the war crimes committed against prisoners of war, which is again against international convention. I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Illia Samoilenko, a hero defender of Mariupol. He is a former prisoner of war. He joined his regiment in 2015 when he was still a 21-year-old student at university. He was a history student. And yet he left to join the war. He paused his education and went to Mariupol shortly before the great events of February 2022, which shocked this body as well as everybody around the world. You may have heard him because of his valiant defense of the city of Mariupol and staying within the Azovstal steelworks facility until his very last day, communicating with the international community. And we were very grateful as an international community to have a voice directly from that facility. Without further speaking on my part, I would like to present Mr. Samoilenko.
Greetings to everyone. Big honor and somehow pleasure to be a participant of great meetings of this level. First of all, I want to start just from the little beginning, from the story, to let you know a bit better about what we're doing, who I am. I'm a deputy commander of the National Guard's Ukraine Brigade, Azov. Yeah. Our unit was defending Mariupol alongside with other neighboring units for 86 days. We've been fighting against overwhelming enemy firepower, enemy aircrafts, enemy personnel, armored units. They've been overpassing us in all accounts, but not in all. Actually, they were never as motivated and as dedicated as we are. And right now, a lot of Ukrainians are forced to be soldiers, forced to be on the front lines. They never chose this path. They never wanted to be soldiers. And 1 year ago, a lot of hundreds of thousands of people in Ukraine would not just imagine that during these days, they might be soldiers. When the battle has started, as formally said, there's no turning back. And we've been fighting 86 days in total isolation. in encirclement and to the nearest forces of Ukrainian army. It was like almost 100 kilometers. But this story is not about combat actions, yeah, but it's mostly about the human rights and humanitarian questions. But my opinion and my point of view as a military person, that's the solution to the humanitarian problems. It lies on the battlefield. I will not like tie the blanket too much on the combat aspects, yeah, because like, you know, it's for the other types of meetings. But we heard a lot of words today about the Russian atrocities that they've been doing to the civilians, about mass graves, about rape, plunder, about deporting of children, about deporting of regular civilians, about filtration camps that are also seen, about inmates in captivity, the prisoners of war who also treated like, well, far from ideal, I might say. And these are just the top of the iceberg. These are just the things that we can investigate. These are just the things that are unveiled, uncovered, because we are recapturing our territories. Regarding the Izum, Liman, Kharkiv region, regarding the Kherson region on the south of Ukraine, you should know that without liberation of Ukrainian territories, like 80%, maybe much more percent of their atrocities and crimes will still be uncovered, undiscovered, unveiled, and uninvestigated. And we cannot allow that. We cannot allow that to happen. For the last year, Ukraine, you know, we became a spearhead of the world fight against the tyranny, against the oppression, against the like collective evil. Yeah, and the world somehow right now is united and somehow is separated between. You can support. There are sides in this war. Yeah, actually, and but it mostly like not my sphere of competition, because like I'm a military person. I know what I do, and like I know what I should not do. I'm a guest in this world, like all these events, meetings, yeah. Like for the last couple of months, I became a rather often participant of the events like this. But in a couple of days, I will return to my battlefield, to my world, where Ukrainians are struggling each day. First of all, we started this like somehow testimony, just about like to show my story, yeah, but. It's just my story. There will be a couple of more other stories by other speakers, yeah, but you should know that there are hundreds of thousands of stories that cannot be told, and they will not be told because these people are silent. These people are dead. These people are under Russian captivity, in Russian captivity. They are under the occupation on still unliberated territories. And I might say again, yeah, the only solution to humanitarian and human rights problem lies on the battlefields, because you know how it works. The one thing that happened to Ukraine, that we became a battlefield again, like hundreds of years ago, like dozens of years ago in the previous wars. But this war is like it's much worse. Comparing to the classic maneuverable wars of third generation in 20th century, we can stream it online. Yeah, and you know, we also been somehow streaming online the combat actions in Mariupol, and that's how the world knew about what is happening. What happened in Mariupol and in other cities is actually basically a genocide. We've seen this in the Russian tactics, military tactics. It's not just about the recent bombardments of residential buildings. It's not just about the recent attacks on the civilian infrastructure, or not just about vicious attacks with long-range cruise missiles for the civilian objects. Yeah, because in Mariupol and in Kharkiv, we seen it's like a part of military tactics of the ground forces. Because like if they're putting their strategic goal to destroy our infrastructure, that's the one point. But if they are putting other goal to destroy houses of people where they live. That's basically a different point. We've seen that in tactics in Mariupol when they've been performing indiscriminate bombings on the civilian houses. They also been doing this in Kupiansk, in Kharkiv, in many other cities. But in Mariupol, I witnessed this with my own eyes. Actually, one eye. Yeah, the other one is artificial. Not just the bombardments, rocket strikes, multiple launch rocket systems, naval artillery, naval rockets, all this barrage of arms dropped on the civilian buildings. And tens of thousands of people died there. And these human rights violations, like severe human rights violations, cannot be still investigated properly, as well as the other atrocious crimes committed by the Russians regarding the inmates in captivity, the prisoners of war. For example, the terroristic act that happened in Olenivka prison on the July 29th cannot be properly investigated because Russians are not letting in the delegation of the proper organs to investigate that. Yeah, and what happened back then, most of you probably know, but a couple of hundreds people were transferred from one barrack to another one, and the barrack was basically blown up, exploded from inside. People basically died in their sleep peacefully. Me as a prisoner of war, I know how it feels, because Russian captivity is not just it's not what you think. It's not still a place for a vacation after a long period of enduring battle. It's the have you ever seen the movies about Gulag? Yeah. Well, just imagine that, but a bit worse. Yeah, because we've been frequently asking about the conditions, how it was there, how do we felt, but it varies from the places where you are upholding. It varies from the shifts that are taking you inside. It varies from how sadistic they might be, because the Russian fantasy about in this direction is honestly limitless. But Russians can do only two things good. They are shitty at everything. They can do only two things good. They can lie and try to intimidate. Just don't catch up on their lies, and don't catch up on their intimidation, and everything will be fine. And also, right now, what I see that Russians challenged the world order of collective defense, of civilized agreements, of all these things that we really get used to, all these things that makes our lives better, because we're negotiating, we're talking, we're communicating, and we're making things better. They challenged that not just 1 year ago, they challenged that 9 years ago, well, exactly 9 years ago, when they started the invasion and occupation of Crimea. And this is when everything started. But they've been preparing the grounds for this for many decades before, and the world was a bit hesitant. I guess we were hesitant. We were not so decisive, not so resilient, not so determined as we are right now. Because right now, I see that a lot of good people in the world were trying to cooperate, we're trying to break through the walls. Yeah, we're establishing new mechanisms, we're establishing new parts of how we should live in this world. Yeah, and this is rather good feeling. But it's a bittersweet feeling, because every day when we are talking, every day of hesitation costs lives. Every minute of hesitation costs lives. I want to remind that, I've been telling this in my streams from the Azovstal plant, nothing changed since then. Nothing changed. The hesitation means lives. The hesitation and the time of waiting while we are just preparing, organizing something, this means that people are still holding in captivity. People are still under occupation, and only God knows what happens to them. Because, as I said before, there are hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of stories that will not be heard by us, because these people are silent. These stories should not ever been happen, because, as I said, Ukrainians been forced to become soldiers. But you know, it's very good, and I'm proud to say that we are not just soldiers, we are a warrior nation, and thanks God, like we have like our pride and your support of free world, and a lot of words already been told by the officials, by the people who are in charge, yeah, and you know, for me as the like a relatively lesser man, yeah, because like I'm just the front page of my kind, yeah. I present my unit and my country, and I'm proud of it. I'm proud to be here, and I'm very happy to be here actually. And this happened only because, like, after my captivity in Russian prison in Moscow in solitary chamber, I was released. I was released by the collective actions of Ukrainian government, the president's office, yeah, the GUR, intelligence agency, the coordination staff, yeah, that representatives are also here present today. Yeah, and I want to say great thanks to all these people who are involved in this process, because otherwise I will not be sitting here talking with you and, you know, being in this wonderful city, in this wonderful country, and have an ability to return to my wonderful country. So, as a conclusion, I will finish with only one well-known word as for the triumph of evil, the only thing is necessary is the good men do nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Illia. I will once again remind everybody that we will try to get in a Q&A session both in this panel discussion and the one immediately thereafter. For those who are, I'm encouraging you to sign up for questions. Please sign up for the list at the checking stations, and we'll try to get to those towards the end of our remarks today. Our next speaker is Mr. Artem Dyblenko to my left. For those of you who are still looking, we do have a QR code for the program if you need to cite anybody's name for your question. Mr. Artem was a Marine who was among several hundred Ukrainian fighters who returned from captivity only a few months ago. He also defended Azovstal in Mariupol, and he was twice recognized with the Knight of Order for Courage. Following his latest release only a few months ago, he very publicly stated, "If hell exists, then I have been in it twice. First Mariupol, then Azovstal." Mr. Artem, the floor is yours.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, here is a man who hardly looks now like someone who has been in Russian captivity. But 5 months ago, I weighed 40 kilograms less. All my ribs, some of which were broken, could be counted visually. All I had to do was just to take off my t-shirts. When I looked in the mirror, in the first day after the exchange, I did not recognize myself. You have the opportunity to see now what I saw in the mirror then. I think the difference is obvious. Until February 24, I lived in peaceful Mykolaiv city. Run a small business, including being the head of the region's largest news agency, which of the past 20 years has been promoting the rule of law, the values of democracy, and fighting for human rights. Everything has changed at the moment, when a already dictator Putin from a neighboring country decided to destroy our country. I, like tens of thousands of civilian Ukrainians, immediately joined the armed forces to defend not only our country, but also the ideological values to which Ukraine has been striven all the years since gained independence, breaking free from prison nations in 1991. Together with ordinary Ukrainians like me, we defended Mariupol. We can talk for a long time about those days of defense, about ton bombs that the Russians dropped on the heads of the citizens. But now, I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about my comrades who remain in captivity, of the occupiers who came to our land. I was in Russian captivity 125 days. This is about 3,000 hours. 3,000 hours of physical, moral, psychological abuse. 3,000 hours of Russian hell. Do you know what a walk in Russian captivity is? Is when you are forced to run past Russian sadists who beat you with hands, feet, and sticks. It's hard to call what we were fed food. Just as it's difficult to call those who abused me and my brothers human beings. Those who continue to abuse thousands of Ukrainians in Russian torture chambers. There are no words that can convey all the horrors that are happening there. I understand that seeking justice from the Russian Federation is the same as seeking justice from a serial killer. He plans in cold blood, thinks through the blood crimes, kills and tortures, but tries to discuss himself and pretend to be the greatest humanitarian in the world. This is what the Russian Federation is actually doing today, coming to Ukraine land and committing genocide against Ukrainians. Today, I'm looking for justice in this building, where distinguished representatives of the United Nations member states are gathered, where the law is not just a word, and respect for each other is real. I'm looking for help in this hall for my brothers, because whether I know they have no weapons to equalize the chances in the confrontation with the executioner. There are no bulletproof vests to protect themselves from beatings. There are no first aid kits to treat themselves. Because whether I know, even basic first aid is totally out of the questions. All they have is faith and love in their heads for their homeland and their families, from they whom they went to defend. But especially this priceless faith Russian tortures and persistently trying to break. There is no peace where I was. There is no humanity. Where I was, human rights mean nothing. Where I was, there was only suffering and waiting for death. And of course, death itself. In the cell where I was, a prisoner died of torture in my arms. I can hardly forget everything I saw in Russian captivity. But this is in your power to make something that there will be less people like me. You have the power to stop the torture and abuse of Ukrainian prisoners of war captured on their own native land by a fascist horde who have no idea what dignity is. You can help Ukraine to bring all the heroes home to their families as soon as possible. That's all I'm asking from you. We will stop this war with our victory. We are stopping it with terrible cost, the cost of lives of our best people. We are stopping this war with the help of your support and the unity of the anti-civil war, for which we are sincerely grateful for you. But I am begging you to do everything what is in your power to save those who are now, in this very moment, in enemy prison and fighting for their lives and dignity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Artem. Thank you to our two prisoners, former prisoners of war who are testifying today. Often in this body and international discussion, we talk about numbers, and today, especially these two panels, we are not only privy to hearing directly from the people that these crimes affect directly, but as in the case of our next speaker, prisoners of war are people, and people have families. And with that, I would like to introduce Ms. Natalia Husak, who is here representing the Association of Families of Prisoners of War in Ukraine. Ms. Natalia.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Natalia Husak. I am a wife of prisoner of war, and today I represent all families of prisoners of war who were captured. On behalf of all the families of prisoners of war in our group, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to you for your sincere desire to help the Ukrainian people in our tragic situation, and we appreciate the opportunity to convey to you our problem and the importance of its solution. We once again draw the world's attention to the fact that thousands of lives of Ukrainian prisoners of war are under that threat every day, every minute. We live in constant stress every second. We worry and fight about the lives of our defenders, children, husbands, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters. We were talking about our worries, and at the same time we understand that there could have been no such worries if Russia had adhered to the principles of international humanitarian law. The rules of conduct and world coexistence adopted by the international community were rudely, brutally, and cynically violated by the Russian Federation. Death, murders, and tortures, suffering, the threat of starvation this is what Russia broadcasts by its actions. Cruelty and lawlessness are especially vivid, obvious, and evident in the treatment of our prisoners of war in Russia and in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. What we see? We see that Russia is violating conventions binding on all mankind provisions of international humanitarian law, committing crimes against humanity. We don't see a proper response to Russia's illegal action regarding, first, violation of the right to life. The Russian Federation constantly violates Article 13 of the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, here and after the convention, which emphasizes the humane treatment of prisoners of war. Everyone has the right to life, and no one has the right to infringe upon it. However, in the context of Russian captivity, he is not an axiom. Acts of torture, humiliation of honor and dignity are carried out by the Russian Federation against all prisoners of war, which violates the European Convention of Human Rights, right to life, prohibition of torture. Second, safety assurance. In violation of the Geneva Convention, Russia is holding captured Ukrainian soldiers in ordinary regime penal colonies, failing to convert the prisons into POW camps. In addition, many prisoners of war are held on the territory of the so-called DPR or LPR, where there are constant hostilities. The Geneva Convention clearly stipulates the prisoners of war captured in the combat zone, but be evacuated as soon as possible to camps located at a sufficient distance from the danger zone. The conditions in these camps must be no less favorable than those enjoyed by the troops holding them captive in the same area. 3. Guarantee of health and provision of medical care and services. Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russian captivity have ever limited access to medical care. According to this, those who have been returned from the captivity, medical care is provided only in emergency cases of severe injuries and illnesses, when the inaction of the regular medical staff of a hospital or prison can lead to death of a prisoner of war. Ukrainian prisoners of war who, because of participation in hostilities, have sought wounds, fractures, amputation of different degrees, injuries from shell fragments, post-concussion syndrome remain without acute medical care during the entire time of their captivity. 4. Condition of detention of Ukrainian prisoners of war. The conditions of detention of Ukrainian prisoners of war on the territory of Russia and on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, which are deliberately created by the aggressor state, are violent and inhuman. Lack of food and drinking water, insufficient medicines and lack of proper medical care, lack of beds, overcrowding of detention cells, poor sanitation, lack of basic personal hygiene products, warm clothes. 5. Nutrition of Ukrainian prisoners of war in captivity. There are a number of facts of violation Article 26, Chapter 2 of the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, which stipulates that the basic daily food rations shall be sufficient in quality and variety to keep prisoners of war in good health and to prevent loss of weight or the development of nutrition deficiencies. 6. The right to information about prisoners of war, correspondence received or parcels. Families of the defenders of Ukraine for a long time, and tomorrow will be the year when many of us don't now receive information from our relatives who are in captivity in Russia. I'm so sorry. We don't know where our relatives are detained, their state of health. We have not been able to contact them for months. Meanwhile, according to Article 1772 of the Convention, we have the right to know information about the state of health, condition of detention, and to have the opportunity to communicate with our prisoners of war, to give them vital medicine, clothes, and others. But this right is not provided to us. Accordingly, the rights of the families of prisoners of war and the prisoners themselves are violated. 7. The right to monitor the rights. We once again draw the world's attention to the importance of visiting places of detention of Ukrainian prisoners of war, even in the absence of full permission from the Russian Federation. We ask for your assistance to ensure that the responsible organizations, in particular the international community, Red Cross representatives, have the opportunity to at least partially inspect the places of detention of our defenders. This will be a significant step towards the observance of their rights and the aggressor's compliance with international humanitarian law. None of the released Ukrainian prisoners of war saw representatives of international organizations. None. 8. Release of known non-combatants. Ukrainian medics and musicians of military orchestra who are considered non-combatants under the convention can be held captive in Russia for almost 10 months. Non-combatants cannot be the direct object of an armed attack of the enemy because, unlike combatants, they are not subjects of violence on a military conflict, as defined by the Hague Convention. Accordingly, when detained by the enemy in the course of hostilities, they shouldn't be considered prisoners of war. However, they are in the captivity of Russia Federation. Finally, I would like to appeal you to, on behalf of thousands of Ukrainian families of prisoners of war. We ask you to faithfully develop the proper practice of implementation of the Geneva Conventions and prevent violations of their provisions. We ask to immediately facilitate the release of all Ukrainian prisoners of war who belong to the armed forces but don't directly participate to hostilities, non-combatants, and provide assistance to them. We ask for support in establishing a mechanism to be able to systematically keep to touch with our prisoners of war and to provide them with vital medicines, clothing, as other staff, as well as to facilitate the responsible outsourcing to carry out visits and inspections in places of detention of Ukraine prisoners of war, even in the absence of full permission from the Russia Federation. Since Russia doesn't comply with the standards of humanitarian law and infringes on the life and health of prisoners of war, we, the families of Ukrainian prisoners of war, believe in justice, strength, and effectiveness of international law and count on our understanding, support, and effective steps towards this rescue of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Each of them is someone's son, husband, father, brother, mother, daughters. All of them defend the Ukrainian people with honor and dignity. And now, with thousands of Ukrainians are fighting for the right to life of each of them. We will fight for their rights as long as necessary. Please save the lives of our dearest relatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. As when I met you for the first time yesterday, your words really open our eyes to the plight of not just what we see on the television, not just what we read in news reports or telegram channels, but that all of these events have a real human toll, whether you are on the battlefield, whether you are supporting those people on the battlefield, and especially when the battlefield has come to you in your home. Our next speaker, sometimes it's good after working 24 hours a day to see a familiar face, so I'm really glad to see my friend Ihor on this panel, because perhaps 10 years ago we would have been discussing other things and doing a poetry reading at this time of year. But instead, Ihor, after his service here in this country, returned and joined his brothers in arms in Ukraine. Today, Ihor Sabiha works as at the coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war in Ukraine. Ihor, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, like a lot of my colleagues here in this row, I also have my own small story. A few years ago, I used to be as a Ukrainian diplomat serving here in New York as a Consul General of Ukraine in New York. Last year, after Russia attacked Ukraine, I voluntarily joined Ukrainian armed forces. Then I was sent to Donetsk region, it's a frontline place, and a bit later I joined a wonderful team of Coordinating Office for Prisoners of War. So now I work there. Coordinating headquarters for POWs, it was formed last year on March and is headed by the Commander of Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, General Budanov. It is a state structure that includes representatives of ministries, departments, and all law enforcement agencies in Ukraine. It organizes prisoner exchanges with Russia, monitors compliance with international humanitarian law regarding prisoners, supports families of Ukrainian soldiers who have disappeared or are in captivity, legally, socially. The issue of Ukrainian prisoners of war is thorny and important in Ukrainian society and is under great consideration of Ukrainian President Zelensky and his team. According to Geneva Convention, all exchanges are to be done after the war. Nevertheless, despite this, we freed almost 2,000 Ukrainians. 107 of them are civilians, 180 Ukrainian women. Now I want to draw your attention how Russian Federation organized the detention of POWs. I mean the list of the main gross violation of human rights of prisoners of war. Russia violates the right to life. Russia holds prisoners of war as criminals. Russia does not provide proper medical aid. Russia holds prisoners in humiliating conditions. Russia does not provide sufficient food. Russia does not allow prisoners to contact their relatives. Russia violates the right to monitoring. And Russia refuses to release non-combatants. Today, state of Ukraine and our headquarters for POWs provides a unique work and services in 21st century. And we are ready to share with our experience with you. And the last thing I want to say, that the key factor of successful exchange of prisoners of war is Ukrainian armed forces. And let's remember, saving the world, the one life, you are saving the whole world. Slava Ukraini!
Glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes.
Thank you, Ihor. I'd like to now turn to, just going to change the schedule just a little bit, and our Milena. Okay, so we're going to go to the Executive Director of Public International Law and Policy Group, Professor Milena Sterio. Okay, hold on, we're going to switch. Please ignore what I just said. We have been joined by the next speaker according to my program, so I will give her a chance to draw breath and then introduce Her Excellency Ms. Linda Thomas Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations, a member of President's Cabinet with Minister rank. Madam Ambassador.
Thank you very much. and the other co-sponsors for bringing us together for this sobering but vitally important side event. 1 year ago, Russia launched its unprovoked, illegal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The same day, President Putin delivered an outlandish speech in an attempt to justify his war of aggression. Putin told the world he was invading Ukraine to protect Ukrainians from quote-unquote bloody crimes. Of course, this was a total distortion of reality. It is his own forces that have carried out atrocities against the Ukrainian people. And we've just heard about the tragic circumstances of POWs and their families. As we made clear this week, the U.S. believes Russian forces have committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine. Crimes against humanity. This is not a determination we make lightly, but in this case, the evidence is overwhelming. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, established by the Human Rights Council in March of last year, and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine have documented a wide range of atrocities and other abuses committed by Russian forces. Summary executions, arbitrary detentions, torture, rape, and other forms of gender-based violence and sexual violence. And we know women, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, and other marginalized groups are most vulnerable to these attacks. Last November, I traveled to Ukraine and I met with victims of Russia's war crimes. Women who had been tortured by Russian forces, elderly people who had been kicked out of their homes, children who wanted nothing more than to go back to school and see their friends. It was gut-wrenching. As a mother and grandmother, I am deeply disturbed by the horrors being perpetrated against Ukrainian children. Credible reports indicate Russian officials have orchestrated the transfer, relocation, re-education, adoption, or fostering of thousands of children. Some of these children have been orphaned during the war, and some were already living in institutions for serious health needs. In many cases, parents sent children to what they thought were summer camps for their child's safety, but were then denied contact and reunification with their children. In other cases, parents refused to send their children to Russian camps, and Russia's occupation authorities enrolled them anyway. And let's be clear, this is not some offshoot operation. We have evidence that President Putin and the Kremlin are actively engaged in this effort to deny and suppress Ukraine's identity, their history, and their culture. And we must call on Russia to end this inhuman campaign. Return children to their parents and their guardians, provide registration lists of the children it has removed, and allow independent observers to access facilities within Russian-controlled or Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine and inside Russia itself. The United States also condemns credible reports of abuses against persons with disabilities. Russia's war of aggression has compounded the significant attitudinal, physical, and environmental barriers faced by persons with disabilities. It is that much harder for these Ukrainians to access services, including accessible shelters, safe evacuation options, and health services. And persons with disabilities face disproportionate risk of neglect and abandonment, including by their own families in some cases. So we must ensure that when the international community rebuilds from this terrible war, persons with disabilities are at the forefront of decision-making and policy-making at all levels. Colleagues, I want to highlight the need to renew the mandate of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine at the upcoming HRC session in Geneva. Since last March, when Secretary Blinken first determined that Russian forces have carried out war crimes in Ukraine, and since the Commission found reasonable grounds to conclude the same, the evidence of atrocities and other abuses has continued to mount. The Commission must be able to continue its critical work, and I urge the HRC to renew the mandate. There must be accountability for Russia's atrocities. And mark my word, there will be accountability for Russia's atrocities. But right now, what the Ukrainian people need most desperately is peace. As President Biden said during his visit to Kyiv this week, and I quote, "President Putin chose this war. Every day the war continues is his choice." Our message to President Putin is this: in this war, in your campaign of brutality, in the suffering your forces have wrought on Ukraine and on the world. But until that day comes, we must all stand with Ukraine. We must all stand behind the UN Charter. And we must all stand for accountability in the face of unconscionable human rights violations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for your remarks. And we thank you for emphasizing the word peace, which is often left behind, again, in international discussions about the conflict. As we have been reminded throughout this period since the full-fledged aggression began a year ago this week, that membership in this organization is in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, which is open to all peace-loving states, accepting the obligations contained in the United Nations Charter. Those obligations include that members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice prevail. Our next speaker can speak to that at length. She represents the Public International Law and Policy Group, PILPG, which has advised and consulted with numerous states around the world, promoting the utilization of international law and advising numerous governments and non-governmental actors throughout the world about protecting human rights and prosecuting atrocity crimes. With that, Professor Milena Stereo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad that it's about 12:02, in which case I can wish you a good afternoon. Otherwise, I was beginning at precisely noon, in which case I did not know whether I should say good morning or good afternoon. So thank you for those. Thank you for the introduction. It is absolutely an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. As you mentioned, I'm here on behalf of the Public International Law and Policy Group, which is a Nobel Peace Prize nominated NGO, which has been working tirelessly on accountability and documentation in Ukraine since the start of the war, including also working with the United Nations Commission of Inquiry for Ukraine. The PILPG continues to tirelessly work on accountability, justice, and documentation in Ukraine. My remarks today will focus on 4 topics, which I believe are particularly relevant for the war in Ukraine. First, basic protections afforded to POWs under international humanitarian law. Second, IHL protections extended to POWs who are seriously ill. Third, ICRC access to POWs. And fourth, prisoner exchanges under international humanitarian law. I will conclude my remarks by offering some brief conclusions in light of the relevant IHL provisions, which I will first outline. So first, what are some basic IHL protections which apply to prisoners of war? Under IHL, prisoners of war are afforded specific rights and protections. These rights are outlined in the Third Geneva Convention of 1949 and also in Additional Protocol 1 of 1977. Some key provisions of IHL relating to POWs include, first, the definition of POWs. Article 4 of the Third Geneva Convention defines a POW as any person who falls into the power of an enemy during an international armed conflict. the status of a POW is not affected by any unlawful act they may have committed prior to their capture. Additional Protocol 1 further expands the application of this principle by establishing that prisoner of war status is granted both to groups of armed forces and to anybody taking part in the hostilities. The Third Geneva Convention and Additional Protocol 1 stipulate that where doubt arises as to whether somebody is entitled to the status of a POW, status shall be determined by a competent tribunal and not by the detaining power. Very importantly, mercenaries and spies do not benefit from POW status under Articles 46 and 47 of the Additional Protocol 1. Second, how are POWs to be treated? POWs must be treated humanely, and they're entitled to respect for their person, their honor, and their convictions. They're entitled to receive adequate medical care, food, and clothing. POWs must not be subjected to torture, cruel treatment, or any form of discrimination. Next, repatriation. POWs must be released and repatriated without delay after the cessation of active hostilities. If a POW cannot be repatriated immediately, they must be interned in a camp until the end of hostilities. Fourth, judicial guarantees. POWs have the right to a fair and regular trial. If they're prosecuted for any acts committed during armed conflict, they must be informed of the charges against them and have access to legal assistance. And finally, communication with the outside world. POWs have the right to send and receive letters and cards, as well as to receive packages and parcels. They're also entitled to have contact with representatives of protecting powers and humanitarian organizations. In sum, international humanitarian law imposes clear obligations on states to treat POWs humanely and to afford them with basic rights and protections. Second, what about seriously ill POWs? Under the Third Geneva Convention of 1949, wounded and sick prisoners of war who are seriously ill or injured and require medical treatment that cannot be provided in the camp where they're held must be released and repatriated as soon as possible. In fact, Articles 109 through 117 of the Third Geneva Convention provide that prisoners of war who are seriously wounded or suffer from specified diseases must be repatriated directly back to their own country or to a hospital in a neutral state. Article 110 then sets forth the specific conditions governing such decisions. So, for example, those whose diseases or wounds warrant a direct repatriation include the incurably wounded or sick, whose mental or physical fitness seems to have been gravely diminished, the wounded or sick who have recovered, but whose mental or physical fitness seems to have been gravely and permanently diminished, and the wounded or sick who, according to medical opinion, are not likely to recover within 1 year. Those who may be accommodated in a neutral state include the wounded and sick whose recovery may be expected with 1 year or sooner if treated in a neutral country, and POWs whose mental or physical health, according to medical opinion, is seriously threatened by continued captivity, but whose accommodation in a neutral country might remove such a threat. In sum, IHL provisions are clear that POWs who suffer from serious medical illness must be repatriated or, at the very least, accommodated in a neutral state immediately. Third, ICRC access to POWs. Under IHL, states are obligated to allow the International Committee of the Red Cross, or the ICRC, access to prisoners of war and other persons deprived of their liberty in relation to armed conflicts. This obligation is outlined both in the Fourth Geneva Convention, which applies to the protection of civilians in times of armed conflict, as well as in the Third Geneva Convention, which applies specifically to the treatment of POWs. Article 143 of the Third Geneva Convention provides that the detaining power shall facilitate visits by representatives of the ICRC to POW camps and all other places where POWs are detained. The ICRC has the right to repeat its visits and to receive reports on the conditions of detention and the treatment of POWs. Similarly, Article 126 of the Fourth Geneva Convention provides that the ICRC shall be granted all necessary access to persons deprived of their liberty in relation to armed conflicts, including civilian internees, detainees, and other persons whose freedom has been restricted for reasons related to the armed conflict. The purpose of such ICRC visits is to monitor the conditions of detention and treatment of prisoners and to ensure that the provisions of IHL are being respected. These visits can help to prevent abuses and ensure that POWs and other internees are being treated humanely and in accordance with their rights under IHL. Thus, IHL imposes a clear obligation on states to allow ICRC representatives access to all detained POWs and other civilian detainees. Fourth and last, prisoner exchanges. Prisoner exchanges are legal under IHL, provided that they're conducted in accordance with the rules and principles of IHL, including the Third Geneva Convention. Article 118 of the Third Geneva Convention provides that POWs shall be released and repatriated without delay after the cessation of active hostilities. This means that at the end of an armed conflict, all POWs must be released and repatriated without delay. However, during the course of an armed conflict, prisoner exchanges may be conducted in accordance with the provisions of the Third Geneva Convention. Article 109 of the Third Geneva Convention allows for exchanges of POWs subject to certain conditions and procedures. In addition, Article 8 of the Third Geneva Convention provides that no prisoner of war may be sent to or detained in areas where he may be exposed to the fire of the combat zone, nor may his presence be used to render certain points or areas immune from military operations. This means that prisoner exchanges must be conducted in a manner which ensures the safety and protection of all POWs. In conclusion, in light of the relevant IHL provisions which I have just outlined, the following conclusions may be drawn. Any detained Ukrainian who has taken direct participation in the armed conflict is a POW. It does not matter if this person has committed some wrongful act prior to their detention. All POWs have to be treated humanely. Any mistreatment of POWs is a violation of international humanitarian law, and it has become abundantly clear in light of the testimony of my colleagues today, as well as in light of other similar testimonies over the past year, that Russia has mistreated POWs and has thus committed clear violations of international humanitarian law. Next, while POWs can be detained during the duration of the conflict, seriously ill POWs must be repatriated. Russia thus has a legal duty to repatriate Ukrainian POWs who are seriously ill. Such POWs cannot continue to be detained. States also have a clear obligation under IHL to allow ICRC representatives access to POWs as well as other civilian detainees. Russia is thus also violating international humanitarian law by not allowing ICRC access to the POWs and other detainees that it is currently holding. And finally, it is clear that prisoner exchanges are legal under IHL. While IHL does not impose a duty on states to engage in prisoner exchanges, such exchanges are legal, and in fact, states are encouraged to exchange children and those who are medically infirm. And thus, all states, including Russia, are encouraged under IHL to engage in such prisoner exchanges and to conduct them in a manner which ensures the safety and protection of the individuals being exchanged. Thank you for the time that you've given me today, and I look forward to any questions at the end of this panel.
Thank you, Professor Sterio. Once again, remind anybody who's still interested in questions to go to the check-in to make sure that we have time for that later on. Our next speaker and presenter has been investigating crimes against illegally detained Ukrainian citizens on the sovereign territory of Ukraine, such as those areas of the Crimean Peninsula and the Donbass since 2015. In 2016, the Ukrainian non-governmental organization, the Media Initiative for Human Rights, was launched. And since that time, since that launch, she has been the coordinator at the Media Initiative, which investigates crimes committed in connection with the occupiers' aggression in Ukraine. They document forcible disappearances, improper detention of prisoners, and track war trials in the quasi-legal system within the occupiers' territory. With that, Ms. Tatiana Katrichenko, I present you.
Дякую дуже за можливість говорити у такій поважній залі.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to work in this very important area. I wanted to talk to you about Ms. Lyudmila Husseinova, a woman who was detained in Donetsk region 2 years ago before the full-scale invasion. She witnessed not only the crimes of the Russian Federation committed on the territory of Ukraine after the February 2024, but also she can tell you about the occupation that took place since February 2014, when the Russian Federation began its aggression. I'm glad to meet Lyudmila in these walls after 3 years of her illegal imprisonment, but I also only have 5 minutes with you to say a few very important things. First of all, Russian Federation, the Russian Federation has been detaining Ukrainian citizens in the occupied territories. We could talk about 4,000 persons, whether they were military or the civilians at the same time. The Russian Federation did not define military personnel as prisoners of war, but called civilians, such as Lyudmila, that were detained for their pro-Ukrainian position. They call them spies and divergence. And we know that since February 24, 22, the practice of detention continues. After that, Russia had about 8,000 Ukrainian servicemen.
This happened both of occupied territories near Kyiv, surrounded Mariupol, and captured Kherson, as well on the front line. The Russian side detains and relocates Ukrainian military personnel, violating the Geneva Convention. Also, Russia is doing detention after February 24th, even as before they see in them spies and saboteurs. Only in Kyiv region, which was liberated at the end of March 2022, we counted 123 persons who disappeared, 123 civilians. Majority of them are held in the pretrial detentions on the territory of Russian Federation, Belgorod, or Kursk regions, and also on occupied Crimea. With regard to some of them, we received answers from the Russian Federation that the reason for detention of just simple drivers, construction workers, or journalists because they were doing so-called special military operation. These people are actually hidden from the outside world. They do not provide information about their condition either to their families or to the state. In total, we counted 921 civilians who are currently in the occupied territories or on the territory of the Russian Federation. But this number could be at least 5 to 7 times higher because many civilians are detained together with the combatants, as it was done until February 24th. And fourthly, the number of women among detainees has increased significantly. If until February 24th the detention of military women was an exception, then after we can talk about approximately 500 to 700 detainees. In the 12 months following the invasion, only 161 women, including civilians, were released. How many civilians were detained? It's again unknown. First of all, due to the impossibility of access to the occupied territories and limited contacts with them. But we can definitely say that special conditions of detention are not created for women, which should be determined by the gender. But women are subjected to torture, military women and also civilian. We talked to the women who came from there before 24th of February and after. One of the soldiers, Olga, who was released from captivity, and she told me a terrible thing. She recalls They told me to take off my shoes. I took off my shoes. He, a Russian soldier, took off my socks. He put my feet in the water, and he started running the current. I asked him not to do that. You can imagine. It's important also to know that the process of search for the detained people, it's very difficult. First of all, civilians and also prisoners of war. Russia hides places of detention and constantly moves people, including inland. Everyone knows that some people, for example, from Kyiv region, were moved 5 times at least. We don't know where they are now. When we ask them where these people are, Russian Federation mostly, it's quiet. They don't say anything. We ask at least 10 different agencies of the Russian Federation about whereabouts of these people, and the answer was silence. Secondly, it's impossible to obtain information about the conditions of detention. It is difficult to say what happens in so-called colonies, pretrial detention centers, or basements where prisoners were kept. Russia does not allow representatives of international organizations to visit the detainees, even a representative of the International Committee of Red Cross that now have prisons. But in reality, they are not persistent enough to get there. The third is that Russia is not ready to release wounded soldiers as a priority and stop the practice of torturing detainees. They are not ready to release civilians if they are elderly or have problems with health. Fourthly, there is no existing mechanism for release of thousands of civilians, since the practice of change does not apply to them. They do not apply the Geneva Convention. Maybe there is a need to create a special negotiation platform for the release of civilians and involvement of negotiators on the highest level. For the whole year, even more for 9 years, Russia has been destroying Ukraine and Ukrainians, torturing the military for their resistance, as well as kidnapping civilians for their disagreement with the occupation. And this happened since 2014. It is a systematic practice of the Russian Federation, and we all should know about it. A lot of people have no right to express their thoughts and do not have the right to freedom. Thank you very much for your attention. Дуже дякую.
I'm sorry, I lost my place here. There we are. Change of schedule. So for those who have announced their presence, we have questions and answers today. I know that we have several representatives from different non-governmental organizations who have already voiced a request for comment. So first I would like to turn to the International Red Cross for their comment. Almost. We see you green. Just awaiting the microphone there. There we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I would like to acknowledge the difficult stories we have heard this morning. and also the hardship of thousands of families seeking for news of their loved ones. And pass also two messages on behalf of the ICRC. The first one, and as it was mentioned by the panelists, all prisoners of wars are entitled to receive regular visits from ICRC representatives under the Third Geneva Conventions. While the recent visits we have carried out are a positive progress, we still need to see unimpeded access, repeated visits, and visits that are held privately to happen. So for the thousands of people that we have not visited yet, we also want to shed light on their right to receive such visit, for us to assess their condition and treatment, to share awaited news for their families, and also to provide essential assistance. My second message is also about information about prisoners of war and protected civilians that are deprived of liberty, and this information needs to be shared. So the ICRC has created specifically the Central Tracing Agency, which is a dedicated bureau that establishes specifically a setup to help alleviate the suffering of families who remain without news. We have received and supported thousands of family requests, but we know that many deserve an answer and are waiting for information. So we will remain committed to continue those visits, but also making our best on behalf of the people protected in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. We also have a request for comment from Human Rights Watch.
Thank you for giving my organization, Human Rights Watch, the floor. The anniversary of this conflict is a sobering occasion. Human Rights Watch has been on the ground since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine. And by beginning, I mean 2014, 8 years before Russia's full-scale invasion last year, documenting human rights violations and atrocities, including rape, summary executions, and unlawful attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, attacks on hospitals, schools, and recent targeting of key infrastructure that provides heat and electricity. We have published at least 94 items on the conflict since February 24, 2022. Reports, press releases, articles, videos, and other items documenting violations of the laws of war, including possible crimes against humanity. The overwhelming majority of violations have been on the Russian side, though we have also documented Ukrainian violations. A few examples. Last April, we produced a report on Russian forces' atrocities against civilians in Bucha, which people rightly found horrific. Others quickly confirmed our findings. We documented the abuses on the Russian filtration system, forced deportations of civilians to Russia and areas controlled by Russian-backed separatists, torture, kidnappings, and other violations. Yesterday, Human Rights Watch and C2 Research published a new report on last year's Russian attack on the Kramatorsk train station using illegal cluster munitions that killed at least 58 people and injured over 100 more. We have also documented Russia's invasion's global impact, exacerbating a food crisis in the Middle East and North Africa and the world. We will continue to document abuses by all sides and call for accountability for war crimes. We welcome the international community's commitment to accountability for the countless violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We hope that this desire to ensure there is accountability is a model for other situations. I thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. I'd like to present one last speaker for this panel. Ms. Lyudmila Husseinova is also a representative of the Ukrainian NGO, the Media Initiative for Human Rights. My apologies for not recognizing you sooner, but Ms. Lyudmila, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My name is Lyudmila Husseinova. I am 60 years old. In 2019, I was detained by the representatives, so-called DLR, but these people had Russian passports, and I know it for a fact. They searched my house, and they found books by Taras Shevchenko, Ukrainian language. Also, they found other books in Ukrainian language. They also found Ukrainian flag. And this became a reason to put me in isolator. And these were the most terrible days in my life during this isolation period. I did not see anything. I was there with a sack on top of my head all the time. They forced me to take my clothes off. They touched me. Only men were present there. Every day they were constantly, we were monitored by video cameras. They prohibit us from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. be seated on the chair or maybe lie down on the bed. Once I was so tired and I just sat on the seat and I was beaten heavily. I was lucky because my family member looked for me for a month. They paid a lot of money for a lawyer, and this lawyer found me and was able to get me out from that isolation cell to another prison in Donetsk region. There I was in the cell with 20 other women that had criminal charges against them. They used drugs. They were killers, and they tried to do the same with me that Russian soldiers did against me. And I was not alone there. That was a situation with the women that were there for political reasons. These people, like me, were there together with the criminals. And this is done especially because these criminals were given instructions to do anything possible against us. This practice they do already for 3 years. During these years, I have seen my lawyer maybe only 6 times.
This is the practice when, for more than 3 years being in prison, I saw the investigator about 5 times. This practice, when you are not allowed any kind of meetings with your loved ones, when your loved ones do not hear from you, they don't know how they live. That's a practice when they do not provide any medical care whatsoever. This is a practice when you do not go out for walks. And in 3 years, if I maybe walked for about 20 minutes on land, on the ground, when they were taking me from one place to the other, that's all I had. This is a practice when in the last months of being in that prison, they didn't let us out for walks. They didn't give us the possibility to take showers. We didn't have any kind of possibilities to have any basic services and comfort things. And in this minute, while we are talking, there in the prisons, in detainments, at least there are 20 women in the Donetsk detainment center that are there for over 3 years, 4 years. I want to tell you about one woman, Olga Vereshchenko. When she was detained, her son, the youngest son, was 4 years old. She has not seen anything from her son for 4 years. She hasn't heard his voice, but she's sitting there without the court decisions, without any investigations, nothing, and the heart is just breaking, and the pain is overwhelming. I wanted to tell you that I took this document, my judicial conclusion with respect to those torturers. They were taking care of me, if I could say that, and I will testify against them. I want them to be punished. I want the evil to be responsible and be punished. And I'm asking you very much. We know that there is no mechanism to liberate the mechanism of liberating the civilians. Well, then come up with this mechanism. Make sure that these mothers, these civilians, these sisters to be liberated, to let go, because their souls are broken, their hearts are broken. They do not see their children. I'm asking, I'm pleading with you, please do anything you can to let women go free so that they could return to their children. Thank you.
This is the first of 3 panels. The following panel will begin promptly at 3 p.m. I would like to thank all of the panelists assembled, all of the diligent work by the Diplomatic Corps for making this happen. That doesn't just include the Ukrainian Diplomatic Corps, but also all those who made sure to participate today, listen, and add comments. As I mentioned earlier, when I was struck by seeing my good friend Ihor Sibiha again, a decade ago, we would be organizing cultural events as opposed to events like these. And in fact, 9 years ago this month, we were scheduled to honor the life and work of Ukraine's national bard Taras Shevchenko, as was mentioned by Lyudmila, in the ECOSOC chamber. Coins were minted, especially for the 200th anniversary of his birth, for the program at the United Nations. And that program had to be postponed by a month. It was postponed because in the early pre-dawn hours of February 26th, 27th, 2014, the enemy state to the north of Ukraine entered Ukrainian territory and violated its sovereignty. It has remained there to this day. It is through the efforts of our international community, not least of which our good friends at the International Red Cross, that we realize how to treat our fellow man in times of distress. For my great-grandfather, that was thanks to the International Red Cross tending to him after he served in the Austro-Hungarian army in Italy, and I have the paperwork to prove it. Upon his return to his native country, he did not raise a gun again. In fact, was quite against having any military association at all. But he was a dedicated teacher until the enemy to the north of Ukraine once again collaborated with the fascist powers of Central Europe and invaded his hometown of Stry. And when I go visit that town, I can stand in the prison cell where he was bound and beaten to death by the occupying state to the north of Ukraine. He was beaten to death because he taught in the Ukrainian language, which is something that to this day is attempted to be erased, as Lyudmila mentioned, the books that have been disappeared, and that is in stark contrast to the ideals of this body and its predecessor, the Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which tended to my father, who happened to end up in a displaced persons camp, and was given every opportunity by the Western powers who were taking control of the newly liberated territory in Germany, and was recommended by a U.S. major in the Air Force to apply for a scholarship here in the United States. There are ways that we treat our fellow man, and there are ways that, unfortunately, parts of the world people who are dedicated to harming their fellow man, unfortunately, do not live up to the ideals of this body. With that, I would like to once again thank all of our speakers today. I would like to thank all of your presence today and remind everybody that once again, we will be gathering at 3 p.m. for the second panel, followed by the third and closing panel of the day at 5 p.m. today. Thank you very much.